Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today we're talking about a little known composting method that's going to help you get even more nutrients into your soil this season. So let's dig in and let's talk all about Bokashi composting. And if you've not heard about Bokashi composting, don't worry, because not a lot of people here in the US have heard of it either. It's a lot more popular in Europe and also in Asia, which is where it apparently originated. There's some conflicting information whether it's come from Korea or from Japan, but either way, it's a two-step process where you are basically like pre-composting materials and you ferment them in a low oxygen or anaerobic environment, and then you let it ferment. And then after the fermentation period is done, you then bury that waste and it breaks down super quickly. But one of the greatest benefits of it is what you can actually compost using this method. And I'll talk about that in a little minute. But what is Bokashi composting? Well, as I'm sure you're aware, as an organic gardener, the secret to having an amazing and abundant garden is having good soil, and especially good soil from good compost. And one of the key things to having great compost is having diverse materials that go in there, because if you've got lots of different materials going into your compost, they're all bringing in different levels of nutrients, right? You're going to have different nutrients from different materials. So let's say you're adding in like leafy green stalks, right? They're going to have different nutrients that are in them versus some eggshells that you're putting in, right? And the wonderful thing with Bokashi is it ferments these materials using special microbes that are called effective microorganisms, or EM. And you'll see that a lot when you start looking up Bokashi. And they're on this bran starter called Bokashi bran, which looks like kind of little flakes of like cereal, I guess. It kind of reminds me of old bran that's gone mushy at the bottom of the packaging, but it's got these effective microorganisms all on that bran, and you basically sprinkle these microorganisms on top of the material, and it starts to ferment those materials, which helps them to then break down. So what can you compost with Bokashi? I alluded to the fact that you can compost lots of different things with Bokashi, and this is why I really love the system, because a lot of the waste that is coming out of my homestead can't go into the normal composting pile that I have, right? If you put in things like meat and fish and dairy, like they can attract rodents and even predators like bears. Well, with Bokashi, you can compost raw meat, raw fish, cooked fish, dairy, so you can put in things like cheese or yogurt. You can put in some fried foods like scraps, leftovers, those kind of things. Bread, a bit of salad dressing, small bones, not advocating to compost your enemies or anything in here, but when we had our chickens and we were done processing them, all the bits from the chickens that we couldn't eat went into the Bokashi composter. Also, after we've roasted the chickens and eaten them, the bones and stuff, they also got put into the Bokashi composter. You can put in standard things that you can put into a composter too, like fruit and vegetable cores, tea leaves, grounds from your coffee, eggs, eggshells, paper, those kind of things. But you can also put in stuff that definitely attracts some unwanted visitors to a normal compost heap, like bread, cereal, grains, pasta, those kind of things. And I will talk a little bit later specifically about composting dog poop, but that is something that people use Bokashi for, not with their food waste though. use a separate dedicated system. But that's a lot of things that you can compost with Bokashi that you can't use in a traditional composting system. So the fact is that you're adding all of these extra things into there, and a lot of those things are high in nitrogen or fresh materials. And one of the benefits of adding those to a stagnant compost pile or a compost pile that's not working is you can actually speed up that composting and get it kick-started and going again. And that's how I use Bokashi. So I will ferment my waste in the Bokashi bucket. And then when it comes to the second process of burying the material, I actually bury it into one of my larger compost piles, and that thing goes off like the clappers. It is composting like there is no tomorrow, and it's great because it's a good method to enliven a heap after winter's been through, and I want to get things going again, ready before it is planting time and I need to refill my garden beds. Because if you're like me and you're growing in a raised bed that's quite tall, you'll see that you get a lot of drop, a lot of settling that happens of your soil in those. So it's a good idea to top them up each season, and I use a lot of compost to do that. And Bokashi composting allows me to basically turn everything that is in my compost heap into viable compost quickly. So that's one of the wonderful things about Bokashi. And, you know, I'll be totally honest, right? I love using my Bokashi composter because it handles like the main waste that's coming out. So like all of our fruit peelings and stuff go into the normal compost pile. So it might be in the big geo bins that we've got. It might be in the tumbling composters that we've got. But then, you know, we have like a lot of kind of meat scraps and stuff because we don't necessarily want to give that to the dog. And, you know, I really hate putting those into the garbage. Same with like, you know, cooked foods and stuff. You know, maybe I've done a roast and I've got, you know, those little sprigs of herbs and stuff left. And I don't really want to put those in the normal compost pile in case, you know, it's kind of covered in meat juice and it attracts rodents. So I like to use the Bokashi composter to kind of catch those sort of things. And one of the other things that I really like about the Bokashi composter is I don't need to worry about trying to keep worms alive. And I've tried worm composting, oh my gosh, like 5 or 6 times, and I'm just not getting it. And it's very frustrating for me because, you know, I can keep like myself and my family alive and the dogs alive, like doing a good job with that. But trying to keep worms, forget it. I just have not done very well with that at all. And some of my friends that I met through YouTube always give me a hard time about that. And every time we kind of, you know, Skype call and stuff, they always ask me, like, how are the worms doing? Because I just don't do a good job in a traditional, like, wormery setting. So with Bokashi, I don't need to worry about trying to keep worms alive to compost some more stuff. Like I said, you can compost things like fish, meat, dairy, small bones. And if you're buying a commercial composter, and that's what I've got a commercial composter that I bought off Amazon. I've had it for like the last 5 years. It's still going strong. I've not broken the spigot or anything like that yet on it. Touch wood, though now I've said it, I'm probably going to break it this year. But it's a really small footprint, and it doesn't take up a lot of space. And because it operates in a low oxygen environment, it actually needs a really tight fitting lid to work properly. And because it's got a tight fitting lid, it keeps the smell down. So it's not kind of stinky like how some wormeries can get. So that makes it kind of good for if I'm wanting to keep those buckets indoors in the basement, and compost, even though it's, you know, winter outside. I can still keep adding scraps to it. It also makes compost with more nutrients because there's more materials in there. It makes a liquid fertilizer as well. So part of the fermentation process produces water. and a liquid that forms at the bottom of a bucket. And if you've got a pre-made bucket, then there's usually like a little tap or a spigot at the bottom, and the material, like the liquid, drops through like a screen almost, or a piece of plastic with holes in to let the water and the liquid drain out. And that particular liquid it's like a nutrient packed, microbial liquid tea that's produced, and it is amazing for the garden. And I like to dilute about a cup of it into a 3-gallon watering can, and it makes a great fertilizer for things like blueberries and currants that like a slightly acidic environment. And sometimes it's really difficult to, feed blueberries and stuff that you've got in a container, because it isn't going to grow in the soil that you have naturally. So this is a good way to be able to feed those plants, but you can use it on any of your plants really. And it's one of the ways that I was able to grow a really good garden, was using this fermentate or leachate or Bokashi juice, as some other people call it. It was able to not only like give the plants some extra nutrients, but it also helped provide extra microbes to the soil, which then helped to break down more things in the soil, feeding more of the plants. Like the cycle was kind of continuous. So that was really cool. Some people actually put the Bokashi juice neat down drains and stuff, and there's some people who feel that it helps keep your drains working properly. I used to do it when I was in England. Like, I would pour it down the drain if I had too much, because there was some days where I had a lot of juice being produced and some days when there wasn't. So there was times when it went down the drain because I'd already fed my plants and I didn't want to overfeed them with the liquid fertilizer. And I didn't really notice a difference, but you might if you want to try that. The other thing you can do with the liquid fertilizer that comes out is you can dilute it down a little bit stronger into a watering can, like maybe 2 cups of it into a 3-gallon watering can, and you can use that to water your compost pile. And of course you want to make sure that you're adding moisture to your compost pile, because that's going to help it break down. It's also going to help deter rodents from setting up shop in there, because they want somewhere that's dry and warm, and you're going to make it wet, so they're gonna get out of there. But because of those microbes being in there, it will help to kickstart your pile. And that's one of my top tips for using Bokashi, is when you're burying your Bokashi waste after it's fermented, make sure that you use some of the juice to water the pile with to get the best results, to really kickstart that compost heap again. Bokashi doesn't attract pests or rodents, and it doesn't attract flies, because it's kind of pickling your waste, and it creates this kind of acidic environment. It smells kind of sweet and sour. Some people say it's a bit like sauerkraut. Some people think it's like lactic fermented pickles and stuff. It usually smells kind of sweet and sour, and that doesn't normally attract pests or flies, which is really good, because I'm sure you've seen, if you've got a traditional compost pile, you can get flies to that, you can get pests to that. It can cause a number of problems. But it's not all 100%, no issues whatsoever with Bokashi composting, right? There's pros and cons to every method. And for Bokashi composting, the main problem is that it is a 2-step process. You do have this, period where you are adding all of the waste. You've got to keep the air out of it, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. But then you have to let it sit there in the bucket when it's full for 2 weeks to ferment. And, if your bucket's full and you don't have a second bucket, then there's nothing you can really, do with the other waste. It's going to have to go in the trash, because you can't Bokashi it. And then, of course, you've got to bury it afterwards. Now, if it's winter and the ground's frozen, how are you going to bury that waste? That's often an issue that comes up. Or, if you live in an apartment and you don't have an ability to bury it somewhere, that's another issue. So if you run into those things, then you could consider, if you can't bury it into a trench or a hole in the ground, you could get a large growing container, like a plant pot or something, like a large one, and you could put some dirt or compost in the bottom of there, and then you can put your Bokashi bucket in, and then you can cover that with soil. And you need to cover that material that's been composted at least 6 inches with soil to make it sure that it's fully covered and protected from the air, and to allow that to break down. So that is an option. And again, you can also put it into your compost pile. Now, I have put it into both a compost pile that is on the ground, like my geo bin, and I have also put it into a tumbling composter. And the tumbling composter stank to high heaven. It was awful. And it did attract flies and things, because the nature of how a tumbling composter works is each time you tumble it, you're adding air and you're mixing the contents, and that doesn't work very well for a Bokashi. Now, after I put a load more stuff into that composter, then everything started to break down. But initially, oh my gosh, it smelled like death. It was terrible. And I was really lucky that my neighbors didn't complain so much. So that was good. So just be aware that if you do want to put it into a tumbling composter, then you're going to need to put a lot more material in there. You're going to have to add some extra dirt in there, and you're going to need to kind of just let it sit. You don't want to be turning that for a week or two. The other con with Bokashi composting is, I mentioned you're going to need a special bucket with a airtight lid, or you're going to need to buy a commercially built Bokashi composter, which is probably the best way to go. You can make them yourself out of a 5-gallon bucket and put a spigot on there. But you're going to need to figure out a way to create a way to separate the waste from the liquid that's going to come off in there. And you can do that by putting a second 5-gallon bucket into another bucket. So you've got a bucket within a bucket, and the inner bucket, you drill some holes in there to allow the liquid to leach out, and then the very bottom bucket you keep solid, but you put a spigot on there so you can actually drain out that liquid easily, because you don't necessarily want to be pulling them apart to drain off that liquid, because you're going to be introducing more air into there. But if you're buying them, that can be kind of expensive. And they do vary in price. I think when I last bought mine, it was about $50 for a full set. But they can really vary in the price and the quality that's out there. So, do a little bit a little bit of research and take a look at what's going to work for you. There are some ones that you can buy where they've got multiple composters in there. The one that I bought only had the one. I then ended up buying a separate one, so I had more than one. And that's a good tip to think about if you're going to start doing Bokashi, is to have at least 2 composters, because whilst you've got one that's full and fermenting, you can still be filling the other composter. And depending on how much waste you have coming out of your homestead, that can be a couple of weeks before you fill up that container too. So by the time you've got your fermented material that's ready to get buried, the other one's just about filling. You also need a special bran to compost with. So this Bokashi bran has those microbes that are inoculated on that material, and you need a decent amount in there. And if you're composting a lot of things like meat and dairy or fish, you actually need more of the Bokashi brand than you would if you were going to be using things like vegetable peelings and coffee grinds, stuff like that. So that is something to consider, because that can get expensive. Now, you can make it yourself. I have not made Bokashi bran myself. It's something that I keep looking at, but maybe when we move to our forever homestead, that might be an option. But right now, that's not something that I really want to dive into. But if you're good and you want to look into that, then that is definitely a way to save on the cost of buying the Bokashi bran. Now, how to start composting, right? This might be something that you're keen to do. And, there's kind of 7 steps to Bokashi composting, right? And obviously you've got to add your food waste to the composter. And you want to squash out the air that is in there, because the Bokashi bran operate in a low oxygen environment. You need to get the air out. And if you've got an old potato masher, or you've got a thrift store nearby, go ahead and grab an old potato masher and just dedicate it to Bokashi composting, because it works brilliantly to kind of push out all the air, because you're just kind of mashing everything on top and you're knocking all those air pockets out. And then you want to add some of the Bokashi bran on top of the waste. Again, sometimes people recommend 2 or 3 tablespoons. Other people, it's about 1/4 cup. It kind of depends on what you're putting in there. For my homestead, I put in quite a lot of meat and stuff in there. So I'll use anywhere from 1/2 cup to a full cup, which seems like a lot, but I would much rather that stuff really broke down, and I wasn't going to worry about critters coming to the compost heap afterwards. So each time you're going to add your compostable materials to the composter. Yeah, makes sense, right? The compostable materials to the composter. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to mash it down, press out the air, and you're going to add your Bokashi bran on top. And if you are having trouble with it kind of kick-starting, then there's a couple of tips and tricks that I'm going to share to help you get the best out of your Bokashi composter. But you'll essentially keep going through the same process of adding food, pushing out the air, sprinkling the bran on, and replacing the lid. And then once your composter's full, you're going to leave it for 2 weeks to ferment. Now, anytime between you filling the composter and it fermenting, you want to keep opening up the spigot and draining off that liquid that's in there, because if you've got too much of the liquid in there, then the process kind of stops and it can smell really nasty in there. And if it smells of anything other than kind of pickles, that sweet sour smell, if it starts smelling putrid and just like death, then something's going wrong. And there's a few things that we can do to correct some of that before having to dump it all out and start again. But after you have been fermenting your waste for 2 weeks, you then need to take a look at burying the waste. And I mentioned that, you can put it into a trench or a hole in the ground, a large growing container, or like I do, into a big compost pile. You then need to leave it where it's buried again for 2 weeks before planting. And you need to leave it there to break down again. And there's a couple of good reasons for this. Number one, your materials are fresh and they're going to start composting, actually breaking down and decomposing, and that can get quite hot, as in temperature wise, but also it can get hot from, there's a quick release of a lot of nitrogen in there, so that can be kind of deadly to some of your plants. And it's known as it being hot when you've got too much nitrogen in the ground, because your plants will grow really quickly and then they'll just kind of die off and yellow, and it's not good. So leave it at least 2 weeks. so that those microorganisms that are in the soil can break down that bokashi waste that's fermented. And then after that 2 weeks, you're at the soil temperature in that area should be cooler as well, so it shouldn't harm your plants. The other reason for giving it 2 weeks is because it's actually kind of acidic when it first goes in there, and that's because part of the fermentation process is producing lactic acid. And if you remember chemistry lessons, having high acidity in the soil is not necessarily a good thing. So you want to give it 2 weeks and, maybe some water to kind of wash away some of that extra acidity in there, because that can harm your plants too. So you don't want to be planting right on top of it. So give it at least 2 weeks, and then that's going to be the best thing for your plants. Now, when it comes to growing in the area, you don't need to be just kind of growing, acid loving plants in there. Like, the acidity will dissipate over time. And, you can plant, various things on top of an area where you were using bokashi, fruits, veggies, trees, herbs, anything that likes a good rich soil, you can plant on top of there. The only cases where you can't plant things on top of bokashi that are edible is if you are considering using bokashi to compost dog waste, right? Now, I get it. I've got 3 puppies. Well, 2 dogs, 1 puppy, and there's a lot of poop at my house. And bokashi is a method that you could use to compost the dog waste, but you must keep it separate. You cannot mix dog poop waste that you're, composting with bokashi with food waste. It can't go in your composter. It can't go anywhere near where you're growing food. And the reason why is dog poo contains harmful bacteria known as pathogens, and they can get into your food supply. For those of you living in the US, you have probably heard about all of the recalls that have happened because of E. coli or listeria and stuff that have been in food. In particular, there's been a bunch of E. coli breakouts that have happened with romaine lettuce. So the sources of where the E. coli and stuff's come from, they're still under investigation in some cases. It might have come from an animal source. It might not have done. But the reality is, it's just not worth the risk, because those pathogens getting into the food supply, and if you're growing your own food, you can make you sick, your family sick, and it can have dire consequences. So it's just not worth the risk, right? If you want to compost dog poop, that's fine, but keep it well away from anything that you're considering eating or where the kids play or anything like that. And they usually recommend at least 6 foot away. So that's about 2 meters, away from anything that you're going to be growing that's edible. So if you are composting dog poop, keep a separate composter. I would go so far as to labeling it, or maybe even getting a different type so it looks different, the color's different, whatever it takes, so you will never get those 2 muddled up, right? And you're going to need a couple more composters, because depending on how much poop your dogs make or how many dogs that you have, you're going to need more to handle that fermenting. And let's be honest, right? When you're dumping out fermented waste, it doesn't smell great at the best of times, but fermented dog poop, that's got to be like a whole new level of, gut-wrenching smell deliciousness to deal with. I don't bokashi my dog's poop. I've considered it, but the thought of having to dump out fermented dog waste was just enough to make me dry heave without smelling what that's going to be like. So I don't do that. One of the things that we're looking to do is an in-ground dog poop composter, which uses a similar principle. So it's kind of like a bacteria digesting. It's not necessarily Bokashi, it's different microbes, but it's a similar kind of process. But if you do have the stomach for composting your dog waste, then make sure you've got different buckets, that they're labelled. You don't put any food waste in them, and you don't put the fermented dog poop in your compost pile. You don't put it anywhere near you plan on growing vegetables or herbs or medicinal plants, edible trees, edible shrubs, edible bushes. Like, just keep it well away from everything that you plan on eating. Also know where to bury. So I mentioned that you need at least 6 feet or 2 meters away from where you plan on growing your fruit and vegetables or herbs. And just make sure that if you're wanting to plant on top of it, you use ornamentals. You're not using anything that's edible. But also you need at least 8 inches of soil on top of that waste as well. And you're going to need to leave it longer than 2 weeks for it to all break down, because it's poop. It's going to have a lot of nitrogen in there, and it's going to take time for that to dissipate and break down. So just some thoughts there. I find that Bokashi composting is relatively trouble-free, but sometimes there can be things that go wrong, and usually your nose is the best way to tell you that something is going wrong. So maybe it is when you are draining off the liquid. If it's not got that kind of sweet and sour smell, it smells kind of putrid, that is an instant no that something is going wrong. And there's a few things that we can do to check and try and correct those things. So the first thing is to add more bran. More often than not, people don't use enough bran because it's expensive, I get it. But by not using enough bran means that you get other microbes settling in and establishing in there. You can also get molds that establish, and we'll talk a little bit about molds in a minute. So try using more bran. Make sure that you push out and press out all the air. Like I said, use a dedicated potato masher. But also, if you're sprinkling on the bran, try adding like an old plastic bag, or like a grocery shopping bag or something like that, or a piece of plastic wrap on the very top layer, because that's going to act as a barrier and reduce the oxygen that's going to be getting into that. So that sometimes helps you out. Make sure you're draining off the liquid regularly. I mentioned that some days I got lots of liquid and other days I didn't get so much. You want to be at least checking it once a week, if not every couple of days. So make sure you drain off the liquid, and don't be adding, foods or waste materials that are like high in, liquid. So don't be adding things like fruit juice in there, or I don't know, like leftover dregs of beer cans or anything like that. That's not going to help your Bokashi bin at all. So make sure that you are regularly draining off the liquid. Next one is to try keeping it in the dark. Some people like to keep it in the dark. You especially want it somewhere where the temperature doesn't fluctuate too much, because these are microbes and they've got a particular range of temperatures that they work best in. So a lot of people keep them in the basement because it's kind of a steady temperature. It doesn't vary too much, and it's dark. So consider doing that, and that might help your Bokashi composter pick up a little bit. Also smaller pieces, so breaking up the waste into smaller pieces helps create more surface area for your microbes to set up shop, and it also means that you're going to get fewer air pockets, because you're going to be able to compress that waste a lot more if it's smaller pieces. And my favourite tip is a spoonful of sugar keeps the putrefaction down. So if it smells like things are just rotting in there, and you will know if you've never smelt anything that's putrefying before, believe me, that is gag worthy, and you will know it when you smell it. And if you add a tablespoon or two of sugar, it can help kickstart the microbes and stop that putrefaction process. But what you're going to want to do is put in your sugar and then add in some more bran and see if that's going to get everything back to where it needs to be. So that sweet and sour pickled smell. If you see blue or black mold that happens on your fermenting waste, you're going to need to empty your composter, and you're going to need to bury it with some extra Bokashi bran and about 1/4 cup of sugar. When you get blue or black mold that appears on there, it's going to stop those Bokashi microbes from working. Just as some molds, like you might have done an experiment in school where you took like bits of mold off a piece of bread and put it on an agar plate and then watched how it like stopped bacteria growing. Oh, that might have just been me at school. Okay, that was just me for fun. Okay, I am a science nerd and that is one of the things that I do. But molds do inhibit the growth of some bacteria. That's how we came up with various, antibiotics and stuff was from mold growing. So, random bit of trivia for you there. But molds that are blue or black in colour do stop the Bokashi microbes from working. If you see a white mould, that's not going to have the same impact as a blue or black mould, but it's something to keep an eye on. Now, if you do have blue or black mould that appears, then unfortunately you're going to need to dump out everything that's in that bucket into your burying place. Add in some extra Bokashi bran, about 1/4 cup of sugar, because you're going to help those microbes get activated again, and make sure you cover it up with at least 6 inches of soil. And then you're going to need to thoroughly, and I mean really thoroughly, scrub out your bucket. So get an old scrubbing brush, preferably one that you can keep out for that purpose, and get that sucker clean with some hot soapy water. You might even want to consider using a bit of bleach in there to kind of clean it out, because you don't want to restart your Bokashi composting again and then that mold comes back again because you didn't thoroughly clean everything out. So give it all a really good wash out with some hot soapy water, maybe a little bit of bleach if you've got a bad case of black or blue mold that's in there before starting your composter again. And then if you've got white coloured moulds, they don't necessarily interfere with the Bokashi microbes, but they are an indication that there's probably a bit too much oxygen in that bucket, and you need to cover the top layer. So again, you could use an old grocery store bag or something just to cover that top layer to stop the oxygen from the air within the bucket coming through. And you more often see the mould appearing when you're just kind of starting out with your Bokashi, or you've not, filled up the bucket a lot, because there's a lot of headspace that's in there and it's going to have a lot more oxygen that's in it. So there's just some tips and tricks for using a Bokashi composter. And like I mentioned, it's a really good way to get so much more out of your homestead and be able to add so much more nutrients into your garden through composting, which is only a good thing, right? Some of the things that kind of happen with Bokashi that's kind of unusual is after the fermenting, it all kind of looks the same. It's just kind of covered in a bran and maybe a little mummified. It might look a little bit, sort of dry in places, and that's totally normal. It doesn't shrink down like a normal compost pile does, and that's a good thing, because it means that it's retaining a lot more of the nutrients for when it breaks down in the second stage. So you're actually going to be getting a lot more nutrients out of your waste than you are from a traditional compost pile, and that can only be a good thing for your garden, because remember, the more nutrients that are going in the soil, the more you're feeding the soil bacteria, and the more that they're breaking things down into smaller and smaller pieces, and the more accessible that's going to be to your plants. And the healthier your plants are, the better that they can stand up to pests, diseases, changes in, air temperature, like they handle frost, they handle heat, they handle things so much better. So I hope you found this episode helpful. If you do, then please let me know. And until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully and enjoy the rest of your week.